Paradise on earth. That's what they called Kashmir. A valley so beautiful that emperors built gardens just to enjoy its splendor. So strategic that 3 nuclear powers claim it. 1 region, 3 countries, 75 years of conflict. Countless lives lost. How did the world's most beautiful valley become one of its most dangerous flashpoints? This is the complete history of Kashmir, from ancient Hindu kingdoms to Mughal paradise, from British colonialism to Partition's bloodshed, from wars to insurgency to today's uneasy tension. This is Kashmir. Let's begin. The Kashmir Valley sits in the northwestern Himalayas, surrounded by some of the world's highest mountains. Legend says it was once a vast lake, drained by the sage Kashyap, from whom Kashmir supposedly takes its name. Geologically, this is actually true. Kashmir was a lake that drained millions of years ago, leaving behind one of the most fertile and beautiful valleys on earth. Kashmir's recorded history begins around 3,000 years ago. Ancient Hindu and Buddhist texts mention Kashmir as a center of learning and spirituality. The valley became renowned for producing scholars, philosophers, and religious texts. The earliest significant kingdom was established around the 3rd century BCE. Kashmir embraced Buddhism under the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who supposedly visited the valley and built Buddhist stupas. For centuries, Kashmir was a major center of Buddhist learning, attracting monks and scholars from across Asia. The Kashmir Smast caves and numerous archaeological sites reveal this Buddhist heritage. The 4th Buddhist Council was held in Kashmir around 100 CE, establishing the valley's importance in Buddhist history. But Kashmir also maintained its Hindu traditions. Shaivism, the worship of Shiva, was particularly strong. Kashmir became famous for Kashmir Shaivism, a sophisticated philosophical school that influenced Hindu thought across India. The Karkota dynasty, 7th-8th centuries CE, was Kashmir's first major indigenous power. They expanded Kashmiri influence into neighboring regions and patronized both Buddhist and Hindu institutions. The valley prospered through agriculture, benefiting from its fertile soil and abundant water. Then came the Utpala dynasty, and later the Lohara dynasty. These Hindu kingdoms ruled Kashmir through the medieval period, building temples, promoting Sanskrit learning, and establishing Kashmir's reputation as a land of scholars and saints. But the most important historical source from this period is the Raja Tarangini, the River of Kings, written by Kalhana in the 12th century. It's one of the few historical chronicles written in ancient India, documenting Kashmir's kings, their achievements, and their failures with remarkable detail and honesty. Through all these centuries, Kashmir developed a distinct identity. Protected by mountains, the valley maintained relative isolation. Its people developed their own language, Kashmiri, distinct from neighboring regions. The valley became known for its beauty, learning, and spirituality. But in the 14th century, everything changed. Islam arrived in Kashmir. Islam came to Kashmir not primarily through conquest, but through Sufi missionaries who emphasized mysticism, poetry, and universal love. The most influential was Mir Sayyid Ali Hamadani, known as Shah-i Hamadan, who arrived in the late 14th century with hundreds of followers. These Sufis didn't forcibly convert people. Instead, they preached in local languages, respected local customs, and emphasized Islam's spiritual dimensions. Many Kashmiris converted gradually over several generations. The process was relatively peaceful compared to Islamic expansion elsewhere. By 1339, Sultan Shams ad-Din became Kashmir's first Muslim ruler, establishing the Shah Mir dynasty. Over the next 2 centuries, most Kashmiris converted to Islam, though Hindu and Buddhist minorities remained. But Kashmiri Islam was unique. It absorbed local traditions, creating a syncretic culture. Kashmiri Muslims visited Hindu shrines. Sufism, with its emphasis on mysticism and poetry, became dominant. The concept of Kashmiriyat, Kashmiri cultural identity that transcended religious boundaries, developed during this period. The most notable ruler was Sultan Zainul Abidin, 1420 to 1470, called Pasha, the Great King. He was a model of religious tolerance, abolishing the jizya tax on non-Muslims, prohibiting cow slaughter to respect Hindu sentiments, patronizing Sanskrit learning alongside Persian, and inviting artists and craftsmen from Persia and Central Asia. Under Badshah, Kashmir flourished. Persian culture influenced Kashmiri arts, architecture, and literature. The famous Kashmiri shawl industry developed. The valley became known for its crafts, paper mache, carpets, and woodwork. Kashmir also maintained connections with both Central Asia and India. Its location made it a crucial trade route. Merchants crossed the valley carrying silk, spices, and other goods between India and Central Asia. But independence wouldn't last. Kashmir's wealth and strategic location attracted powerful neighbors. In 1586, the Mughal Emperor Akbar conquered Kashmir, incorporating it into his empire. The Mughals fell in love with Kashmir. After the heat and dust of India's plains, the valley seemed like paradise. The emperors made Kashmir their summer retreat, escaping Delhi's scorching heat for the cool mountains. Emperor Jahangir was particularly devoted to Kashmir. He spent several summers there and said on his deathbed, "Kashmir, Kashmir." His wife, Nur Jahan, shared this passion. Together they built magnificent gardens that still define Kashmir's landscape. The Mughal gardens of Kashmir, Shalimar Bagh, Nishat Bagh, Shashan Shahi, are masterpieces of landscape architecture. Built on hillsides overlooking Dal Lake, they feature terraced lawns, flowing water channels, fountains, and pavilions, designed to represent paradise on earth. The Mughals developed Kashmir's infrastructure, built roads, encouraged trade, and promoted agriculture. The shawl industry reached new heights. Kashmiri shawls became luxury items sought across Asia and Europe. But Mughal rule also brought changes. While generally tolerant, some Mughal governors were oppressive. Heavy taxation burdened the population. Kashmir's wealth flowed to Delhi and Agra. Still, this period is remembered relatively fondly. The Mughals appreciated Kashmir's beauty and culture. They didn't try to fundamentally change Kashmiri society, and their gardens remain among Kashmir's most iconic landmarks. But the Mughal Empire was declining. By the early 18th century, it was fracturing. In 1753, Afghanistan's Durrani Empire conquered Kashmir. Afghan rule was harsh, heavy taxes, forced labor, and religious intolerance. This period is remembered as one of Kashmir's darkest. Then in 1819, another power conquered the valley. The Sikhs of Punjab under Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Sikh rule initially brought relief from Afghan oppression, but it was short-lived. Maharaja Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and his empire collapsed into chaos. The British, expanding their control over India, defeated the Sikhs in 2 wars. And here's where Kashmir's modern tragedy truly begins. After the First Anglo-Sikh War in 1846, the British didn't annex Kashmir. Instead, they sold it literally. Sold it to Gulab Singh, a Dogra Hindu Raja from Jammu, for 7.5 million rupees through the Treaty of Amritsar. Think about that. Kashmir, with its Muslim-majority population, was sold like property to a Hindu ruler by British colonizers. The people of Kashmir had no say in their fate. Gulab Singh founded the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. The state had a peculiar demographic. Jammu region was majority Hindu. The Kashmir Valley was majority Muslim, over 90%, and Ladakh was majority Buddhist. A Hindu Dogra dynasty now ruled this diverse, majority Muslim state. The Dogra rulers were often oppressive, especially toward Muslims. Heavy taxation, restrictions on Muslim religious practices, and discrimination in government employment created deep resentment. Kashmiri Muslims were subjected to harsh treatment. They couldn't ride horses in Srinagar, faced penalties for slaughtering cows, and paid higher taxes than Hindus. There was one bright spot. Maharaja Pratap Singh, 1885 to 1925, was more liberal and made some reforms. But his successor, Hari Singh, who became Maharaja in 1925, was authoritarian and resisted political change. By 1930s, Kashmiri Muslims were organizing politically. Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah emerged as the leader of the National Conference Party, demanding rights for Kashmiri Muslims and later calling for democratic governance regardless of religion. The British, meanwhile, treated Jammu and Kashmir as a princely state, nominally independent, but actually under British paramountcy. The Maharaja's power was checked by a British resident, and foreign policy and defense were controlled from Delhi. This was the situation as World War II ended and India moved toward independence. And this is where Kashmir's tragedy would intensify. In 1947, British India was partitioned into two independent nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The partition was accompanied by horrific communal violence. Perhaps 1 million people died, and 10 to 15 million were displaced in one of history's largest forced migrations. The princely states, over 500 of them, had to choose: join India, join Pakistan, or theoretically remain independent. Most joined based on geography and demographics. For Jammu and Kashmir, the choice was agonizing. The state had a Muslim-majority population that geographically bordered Pakistan. By the partition logic, it should join Pakistan. But it was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, Hari Singh, who wanted to remain independent. Maharaja Hari Singh tried to delay the decision, hoping to maintain independence. He signed standstill agreements with both India and Pakistan, maintaining the status quo. But events overtook him. In October 1947, Pashtun tribesmen from Pakistan's northwest frontier province, backed by Pakistani military officers, invaded Kashmir. They advanced rapidly towards Srinagar, looting and massacring along the way. Hari Singh panicked. He appealed to India for military help. India's leaders, particularly the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, himself of Kashmiri origin, agreed, but with a condition: the Maharaja must sign an instrument of accession, legally joining Kashmir to India. On October 26, 1947, Hari Singh signed the accession. The very next day, Indian troops flew into Srinagar and stopped the tribal advance. The First Kashmir War had begun. India argues that Kashmir's accession was legal. The Maharaja, as the legitimate ruler, had the authority to accede to India. Pakistan argues the accession was obtained under duress, that the tribal invasion was a popular uprising, and that Kashmir's Muslim-majority population should determine its fate. The war raged through 1947–1948. Indian forces, with better organization and supply lines, gradually gained the upper hand. Pakistan sent regular army units to support the tribal fighters. The conflict became a full-scale war between the two new nations, but neither side could achieve complete victory. The fighting stabilized along a front line that roughly divided Kashmir. India controlled about 2/3 of the territory, including the Kashmir Valley and Jammu. Pakistan controlled the western and northern areas, which became Azad Kashmir, Free Kashmir, and the northern areas. In January 1949, a UN-mediated ceasefire took effect. The ceasefire line, later called the Line of Control, LOC, became the de facto border. It remains so today, one of the world's most militarized borders. The UN Security Council passed resolutions calling for a plebiscite, a referendum, where Kashmiris would choose between India and Pakistan. India initially agreed, but later argued that Pakistan's failure to withdraw forces made the plebiscite conditions impossible. The plebiscite never happened and remains a source of bitter dispute. Kashmir was now divided. Families were separated. The dream of Kashmiri unity was shattered, and the stage was set for decades of conflict. In Indian-administered Kashmir, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah became the dominant political figure. He had supported accession to India, partly because Nehru promised Kashmir substantial autonomy. This autonomy was enshrined in Article 370 of India's constitution, adopted in 1950. Article 370 gave Jammu and Kashmir special status, its own constitution, its own flag, control over most matters except defense, foreign affairs, and communications. Indian laws didn't automatically apply to Kashmir. It was a state within a state. Initially, he worked closely with Nehru, but tensions grew. Abdullah increasingly spoke of Kashmiri self-determination and independence. The Indian government suspected he was considering joining Pakistan or seeking independence. In 1953, in a move that remains controversial, the Indian government arrested Sheikh Abdullah and dismissed his government. He spent much of the next 22 years in jail or under house arrest. His imprisonment became a symbol of Kashmir's grievances against India. Pro-India politicians were installed. The 1987 election was particularly controversial. Widely seen as massively fraudulent, it radicalized a generation of young Kashmiris and helped spark the insurgency that erupted in 1989. Meanwhile, Article 370 became both a legal reality and a political symbol. For Kashmiris, it represented their special status and promised autonomy. For Indian nationalists, it was an unacceptable concession that prevented Kashmir's full integration into India. During this period, the Kashmir Valley was relatively peaceful, but politically suppressed. Development was uneven, tourism flourished, but economic opportunities were limited. Political freedom was restricted. Kashmiris felt caught between their nominal autonomy and New Delhi's actual control. Culturally, Kashmir maintained its distinct identity. Kashmiri language and culture thrived. The valley's natural beauty attracted tourists from across India and around the world. Dal Lake with its houseboats, Mughal gardens, and mountain scenery made Kashmir India's premier tourist destination. But underneath, resentment simmered. Kashmiris felt their autonomy was being eroded. Indian security forces had a growing presence. Political dissent was suppressed, and Pakistan constantly propagandized, offering an alternative vision of Kashmir's future. Kashmir sparked two more India-Pakistan wars and numerous smaller conflicts. In 1965, Pakistan launched Operation Gibraltar, infiltrating thousands of soldiers into Kashmir disguised as local insurgents, hoping to spark an uprising. The uprising didn't materialize, and India discovered the infiltration. The conflict escalated into the Second Kashmir War. Unlike 1947, the war lasted from August to September 1965 and ended in stalemate. The conflict resolved. Nothing but killed thousands and deepened Indo-Pakistani hostility. The 1971 war was different. It was primarily about East Pakistan, Bangladesh, not Kashmir. But Kashmir was still a front. After Pakistan's defeat and Bangladesh's independence, India was clearly South Asia's dominant power. Yet Kashmir remained unresolved. The Simla Agreement of 1972, signed after the 1971 war, converted the ceasefire line into the line of control. But neither side trusted the other, and the Lok became one of the world's most militarized borders. Through these wars, Neither India nor Pakistan gained significant territory. The Lok remained. Casualties, economic disruption, and growing military presence. The valley that emperors had called paradise was becoming a battlefield. In 1989, everything exploded. An armed insurgency erupted in Kashmir that would kill tens of thousands and transform the valley into a conflict zone. Multiple factors converged. The rigged 1987 election convinced many young Kashmiris that peaceful politics was futile. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan freed up battle-hardened mujahideen and weapons. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, saw an opportunity to bleed India through a proxy war. And Kashmiri frustration with Indian rule had reached a breaking point. The insurgency began with relatively secular Kashmiri nationalist groups, like the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF, who wanted independence from both India and Pakistan. But soon, Pakistan-backed groups promoting merger with Pakistan, especially Hizbul Mujahideen, and later groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, became dominant. The insurgency was brutal, attacked security forces, and targeted Kashmiri Hindus, pundits. In late 1989 and early 1990, Kashmir's Pandit community faced targeted violence. Hundreds of thousands fled the valley in terror, becoming refugees in their own country. This remains one of Kashmir's great tragedies. An ancient community was ethnically cleansed from their homeland. India's response was heavy-handed. Security forces flooded Kashmir. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, gave soldiers sweeping powers and immunity from prosecution. Human rights abuses became common: extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances, and collective punishments. The 1990s were Kashmir's darkest decade. The death toll climbed into the tens of thousands. Tourism collapsed. The economy was devastated. A generation grew up knowing only conflict. Schools closed. Normal life became impossible. Pakistani infiltration continued. Militants were trained in Pakistan, armed with modern weapons, and infiltrated across the Lok. Pakistan denied direct involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. The 1999 Kargil War was a direct result of this dynamic. Pakistani soldiers and militants infiltrated across the Lok into the Kargil district, occupying strategic heights. India discovered the infiltration and launched a major military operation to evict them. The conflict brought two nuclear-armed nations to the brink of war before Pakistan withdrew under international pressure. Kargil was significant because it showed Pakistan's willingness to risk nuclear war over Kashmir. It also showed that conventional military operations couldn't resolve the dispute. And it killed hopes for peace that had briefly emerged when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee visited Lahore in 1999. By the early 2000s, the insurgency was declining, but hadn't ended. Improved counterinsurgency tactics, order fencing, and war weariness among Kashmiris reduced violence. But the underlying issues remained unresolved. In 2001, militants attacked India's parliament, bringing India and Pakistan to the brink of war again. In 2008, after the Mumbai terror attacks by Lashkar-e-Taiba, tensions spiked again. Throughout this period, Kashmiris suffered immensely. Caught between militants and security forces, civilians bore the brunt. Thousands died. Thousands more were orphaned or widowed. Economic development stagnated. Psychological trauma was endemic. And crucially, an entire generation of Kashmiris grew up alienated from India. Whatever goodwill had existed eroded under the weight of military occupation, human rights abuses, and political suppression. The 2000s and 2010s saw a shift from armed insurgency to mass protests. Young Kashmiris, who hadn't directly experienced the 1990s violence, began protesting Indian rule through stone pelting and demonstrations. In 2008 and 2010, massive protests erupted. Triggered initially by land disputes and civilian killings, they revealed deep alienation. Hundreds of thousands protested. Security forces killed over 120 people in 2010 alone, mostly young protesters. The protests were largely peaceful, but the response was violent. In 2016, after security forces killed Burhan Wani, a popular young militant commander, Kashmir exploded again. Months of protests and strikes followed. Pellet guns used by security forces blinded hundreds, including children. The images shocked the world. These protests showed that even without Pakistani support, Kashmiri anger at Indian rule was real and widespread. The narrative that Kashmir's problems were solely due to Pakistani interference became harder to sustain. Politically, elections continued, but turnout was often low and legitimacy was questioned. The People's Democratic Party, claiming to represent Kashmiri aspirations, formed a coalition government with the Hindu nationalist BJP in 2015, a controversial alliance that eventually collapsed. Then came August 5, 2019, the date that changed everything. The Indian government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP, abrogated Article 370, removing Kashmir's special constitutional status. Jammu and Kashmir was split into two union territories, directly controlled by the central government. Kashmir's statehood was revoked. The government imposed a total lockdown, communications cut, internet shut down, thousands arrested, including mainstream politicians, and massive troop deployments. The lockdown lasted months. Kashmir was effectively under siege. India's government argued this would integrate Kashmir, bring development, and end terrorism. Critics called it a unilateral violation of Kashmir's constitutional guarantees and a collective punishment of Kashmiris. The move was hugely popular in India, where Kashmir is seen as an integral part of the nation, and Article 370 as an unjust concession. But in Kashmir, it was seen as the final betrayal, the end of any pretense of special status or autonomy. Pakistan protested vehemently, but could do little beyond diplomatic condemnation. China, which controls parts of Kashmir it captured from India in 1962, also objected. Since 2019, Kashmir has been under tight control. Political activity is restricted. Internet remains throttled. Security forces maintain a heavy presence. Occasional militant attacks occur. The situation is tense, but controlled. Today, Kashmir remains one of the world's most intractable conflicts. The region is divided among three nuclear-armed nations. India controls Jammu, Kashmir Valley, and Ladakh. Pakistan controls Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. And China controls Aksai Chin and parts of Ladakh. The human cost has been staggering. Estimates of deaths since 1989 range from 40,000 to 100,000. Thousands have disappeared, arrested and never seen again. Torture is documented by multiple human rights organizations. Countless families have been shattered by violence. Economically, Kashmir has suffered enormously. Despite natural beauty and resources, conflict has prevented development. Tourism, once Kashmir's lifeblood, has been devastated by decades of violence. Young people face limited opportunities. Unemployment is high. The psychological toll is immense. Surveys show high rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. A generation has grown up with checkpoints, curfews, and violence as normal. What are the positions today? India insists Kashmir is an integral part of India, that accession was legal, and that the only issue is Pakistani-backed terrorism. After abrogating Article 370, India's position is that Kashmir will be integrated like any other Indian state. No territorial compromise is possible. Pakistan insists Kashmir is disputed territory, that the promised plebiscite must be held, and that Kashmiris have the right to self-determination. Pakistan positions itself as the champion of Kashmiri Muslims, but Pakistan's support for militant groups has undermined its credibility. Kashmiris themselves are divided. Some want independence from both India and Pakistan. Some prefer joining Pakistan, seeing it as the Muslim homeland. Some, particularly in Jammu and Ladakh, want to remain with India. And many just want peace, development, and normalcy. The sad reality is that Kashmiri voices are often marginalized in a dispute dominated by India and Pakistan. The wishes of ordinary Kashmiris, who have suffered the most, are secondary too. Geopolitical competition. International involvement has been limited. The UN resolutions calling for a plebiscite are ignored. Western countries have largely stayed neutral, seeing Kashmir as a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. China's position is complicated by its own territorial claims. The risk of escalation remains real. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars, with Kashmir central to 3 of them. Both possess nuclear weapons. Terrorist attacks by Pakistan-based groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed continue to trigger crises. In 2019, after the Pulwama attack killed 40 Indian soldiers, India launched airstrikes into Pakistan. Pakistan shot down an Indian jet. The 2 countries came close to war before international pressure eased tensions. Climate change adds another dimension. Kashmir's glaciers are melting. Water resources are under stress. Both India and Pakistan depend on rivers originating in Kashmir. Water could become another flashpoint. What are the possible futures for Kashmir? The status quo division along the Lok seems most likely, but satisfies no one. Neither India nor Pakistan will voluntarily cede territory. Both have nationalist constituencies that make compromise politically difficult. Independence seems impossible. India won't allow it, seeing it as a precedent for other separatist movements. Pakistan won't accept it because it wants Kashmir for itself. And an independent Kashmir would be a small, weak state surrounded by hostile powers. Merger with Pakistan seems equally unlikely. India will never agree. And after decades of conflict, many Kashmiris don't trust Pakistan either. A plebiscite, once promised, is now unrealistic. India won't allow it. The demographic changes pundit exodus, Pakistani settlement in Azad Kashmir complicate any referendum. Some propose soft borders, allowing free movement across the Lok while maintaining current sovereignty. This could reunite families and ease tensions. But it requires trust between India and Pakistan, something in very short supply. Others suggest greater autonomy within India, restoring something like Article 370 or going further. But after 2019's abrogation, this seems politically impossible. In India, the tragic reality is that no solution seems achievable in the near future. The conflict is frozen, managed rather than resolved. And Kashmiris continue to suffer. Kashmir's history is one of extraordinary beauty and terrible tragedy. A valley that should be paradise has become a prison. A land that emperors loved has become a battlefield. A people known for poetry and gardens have known too much violence and pain. For centuries, Kashmir was defined by Kashmiriyat, a syncretic culture where Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists coexisted, where Sufi shrines and Hindu temples stood side by side, where identity was Kashmiri first and religious second. That Kashmiriyat has been shattered by 7 decades of conflict. Communities have been divided. The Pandit exodus destroyed centuries of coexistence. Militancy and counterinsurgency have brutalized society. An entire generation knows only conflict, yet Kashmir endures. Despite everything, Kashmiris maintain their culture, their poetry, their crafts. Families carry on. Children go to school. The gardens still bloom. The mountains still stand. The international community has largely abandoned Kashmir to India and Pakistan's bilateral dispute. But this is ultimately a human tragedy. Real people suffer: mothers who've lost sons, children blinded by pellet guns, families separated by borders, young people with no future. What Kashmir needs is what it's never really had: genuine self-determination. Not the promise of a plebiscite that will never happen. Not autonomy granted and then revoked, but real participation in determining their own future. The question is not whether Kashmir belongs to India or Pakistan. The question is, what do Kashmiris want? And after 75 years, nobody has seriously asked them, until India and Pakistan find the courage to prioritize Kashmiri voices over nationalist rhetoric, until they value human dignity over territorial claims, until they choose peace over pride. Kashmir will remain what it is today, the world's most beautiful conflict zone. From ancient kingdoms to Mughal gardens, from partition's violence to decades of insurgency, from special status to direct rule, this has been the history of Kashmir. A history of beauty and bloodshed. A story still being written. A paradise still waiting to be peaceful.